Welcome everyone to the talk after lunch. I hope everyone is enjoying the conference so far and has enjoyed lunch. Before I start, let me take the required speaker selfie with everyone in there, hopefully. Great. Everyone say Spring I/O? Great. Now we're ready to start. So I hope we heard a lot of talks about new things and all new features we can do. And I'm going to talk about actually old stuff, legacy applications. And I'm going to tell you something, and if I don't talk too much, I hope to do some demoing also, so I hope to do some coding. I did make some offerings this morning to the demo gods, so I hope they help me, so we'll see. I'm going to show you some techniques which might or might not help you, or which might be valuable to your project. So your mileage may vary on what I tell you here. So about me. During the day, I develop software, just like you. I'm an architect, I'm a consultant, I do a lot of stuff. And when I don't do that, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a lifeguard instructor, I'm a scuba instructor, I write the occasional book. I wrote 2 books, one on Pro Spring MVC and Spring Recipes, the 3rd edition. And I contribute to a whole bunch of Spring projects, Spring Security, Spring Boot. I have a lot of pull requests and issues and everything. But enough about me. So the title of the talk is Spring Boot and Spring Cloud for Legacy Applications. We heard a lot about Spring Boot and probably Spring Cloud also. Who is working on greenfield applications in here? Can you show hands? That's 4, 5. And who's working on legacy, existing applications, not using Spring Boot, Spring Cloud, and everything? Yeah, me too. I have to raise 2 hands to multiple projects. So a lot of people, and most of us, I think, go to a project, already existing project, which has a certain technology stack, might be with Spring, might be without Spring. And you hear all those nice new things on conferences which you want to use. So I hope to show you in this session a few ways on how you can introduce Spring Boot and Spring Cloud technologies to your legacy applications. So when you Google, I needed a definition for legacy applications. So when you Google, the first hit is Wikipedia, of course. And it basically states a legacy system is something built with an old methodology, old frameworks, old technology, and might or might not be replaced. And legacy often is implied with a negative sound or a negative thing, which I don't think it has to be, because if you look at legacy in, for instance, the music industry, if someone leaves a nice legacy, it's basically a great music collection they leave. So for the sake of this session, when I say legacy, I mean every application in production that makes money but doesn't use Spring Boot or Spring Cloud. So that's for the sake of the presentation. And for this presentation, if I don't talk too much and go to the demo, I'm going to take a look at actually an application I wrote myself for Pro Spring MVC, which is the great bookstore we wrote, which is going to be the next competitor for Amazon.com. And we, of course, win. It's written with Spring 3.2. It's written in 2012. Uses Hibernate 4.2. Still uses styles and JSPs. Who's on JSPs? Can you show? Still using JSPs? Oh, still quite a few. We use Xstream for showing XML, Jackson 1 for JSON marshalling. We have a mixture of XML and Java configuration, still deployed as a WAR file. We don't have any monitoring, health checks, everything. So that's the application I'm going to look at, and I hope to introduce some of the newer technologies in there. So why would you want to introduce Spring Boot or Spring Cloud into your applications, and how could you do it? I'm also going to take a little trip around the different challenges you face and the solutions there are. Then I hope I still have time for the demo and for some questions and answers. This presentation is an accumulation of different migrations I did or updates for projects on older Spring versions to a newer Spring Framework version, or migrating something that used an embedded Tomcat or an embedded Yeti with the main class to a Spring Boot application. So I tried to put it all in a single presentation and also in a demonstration. So why would you have an application which is running in production? It's running fine. So why would you want to introduce Spring Boot? Well, because you want to. It's the new kid on the block. It's new. It's hip. It also makes your development a lot easier because, well, you can just do Java min-jar or run your main class from your IDE. IntelliJ and NetBeans have great support, also Spring Source Tool Suite. So you just can run your application in your IDE. You don't need any deployments anymore. It can help you manage your dependencies. Saves you searching for dependencies of libraries that work together. So those can all be things why you want to introduce Spring Boot, or at least a part of Spring Boot. Or maybe you still have a big monolithic application. Who is doing microservices? OK, that's more than I expected. Who is still building a monolithic application? I'm guilty as charged, so I'm also building a monolith. Could be that you're in a migration path to do microservices or do a service-oriented architecture, or in which Spring Boot and Spring Cloud technologies can actually help you. Using Spring Boot and Spring Cloud, Martin Fowler mentioned something about the strangler application or the strangler pattern. I see the different terms on the internet. Who knows what the strangler application pattern is? No hands. Great. I'm going to teach you. What you do is you take your old application, you put a load balancer or a proxy in front of there, and you start ripping apart your old application in smaller applications. And your load balancer or proxy still acts as a single application, but on the back end, you all have smaller microservices. And the beauty of the strangler application is you can step by step migrate your large application to smaller applications. And for the outside world, it still looks like it's a single application. But on the back end, it's completely different. And Spring Cloud with, for instance, the Zool proxy and the config server and all that stuff, that can really help you implement or realize the strangler application. And it can be a migration strategy for microservices. So how? Well, you can try and say, well, we're going to use Spring Boot. I'm going to take 2 months, throw Spring Boot in there, refactor everything to have it auto-configuration of Spring Boot, use my existing configuration, and rewrite parts of the application, and introduce some Spring Cloud technologies. Or you can use selective parts of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud. If you look at Spring Boot and also Spring Cloud, after all, it's just a lot of configuration that's already done for you. And you can use or reuse part of that configuration or do it yourself. So you can use, for instance, the Spring Cloud configuration client. You could use in your legacy application without actually using Spring Boot, which is something I hope to show you later on. So you can use selective parts by knowing what's being configured and doing that yourself. So you can still use a little bit of Spring Boot, but not everything. Mentioned auto-configuration is still just configuration. So a large part of Spring Boot is automatic configuration of your beans. So what challenges might you face when doing such a thing? So for instance, when you go full Spring Boot or Spring Cloud, we're still using Spring 2.5, 3, 3.0, 3.1, 3.2, some hands, 4.0, 4.1. So there are still different versions used. So if you use the most recent Spring Boot version, 1.3, you also have to upgrade to Spring 4.2, which might or might not be an easy task. I found that updating a Spring library is, in 80 or 90% of the cases, straightforward. You just update the version number, and it kind of works. So that's my experience. Unless you run into deprecated library support. Spring has a quite strict policy. They deprecate something in one major version and remove it in the next. So something that's deprecated now is probably going to be removed in the next version. So it still works, but it can be a trigger to refactor your application or part of your application to use the new functionality. You can also run into removed library support. I once migrated a struts1 application, and we upgraded the Spring version, but there was no struts support anymore. So that was a bit of a challenge. So because what I said, they have a strict policy on removing deprecated features of the framework. And also Spring Boot's auto-configuration can be a bit of a challenge, especially if you have an existing application and try to merge everything together. Most of the time, Spring Boot is pretty smart in figuring out which beans are already there. So if you have a data source, it doesn't do anything. But still, there are some situations in which it can take a while to figure out how to set up things correctly. So that can be quite a challenge. So if you use selective parts of Spring Boot, you don't use Spring Boot, so you have to do a lot of manual configuration. So you can't use the Spring Boot auto-configuration magic. I put it between quotes deliberately because, well, it's not really magic. It's still just configuration. They're still just classes annotated with add configuration. So they're just regular configuration classes. It can be a bit of a hassle to get the different auto-configurations work manually. So sometimes it's easier to just manually configure the beans instead of trying to shoehorn the configuration class into your existing application. And it requires you to know the sources of Spring Boot. It requires some digging into the Spring Boot source code, which is also something nice because you can learn something from how they created a project. But there's still a lot of auto-configuration going on, so it might be confusing on what comes first and then, or what dependencies it needs. And so it can be quite a hassle to figure out. But it requires some digging. I don't mind, but other people might find it a bit tricky. It might be that you have some old version that's incompatible, which you can't easily upgrade, so that can be a challenge. Especially Spring Boot does some dependency management for versions. So if you have an older Hibernate version, for instance, that might not work, and upgrading Hibernate can be easy, but if you use some specific features, it might break. I had that on multiple occasions. So some solutions. You can upgrade Spring and all the other Spring Portfolio projects generally quite easily. They're pretty much backwards compatible, unless you run into the removed library support, of course. But functionality, from a functional point of view, they're pretty much backwards compatible, even in the binary sense. There are some discussions on the bug tracker, for instance, like, can't we replace commons logging with slf4j? And Jürgen keeps saying, no, we can't, because it breaks binary backwards compatibility. Some other code upgrades might not be that easy and requires you to do some refactoring before you can use Spring Boot. So it depends on which versions you use. I hope you're not on really old versions, but you never know. I worked on not that long ago, I worked on a version of an application that still used Spring 2.0. So on Java 1.4, so that was a bit of a step back from Java 8. So deprecated, you can upgrade your library. You can still use it. It's not removed, but it's a trigger to do something about your code base or about that functionality, because it probably will be removed in the next version of Spring. So what about removed library support? Well, if your application isn't that big, you could rewrite that part of your application to the new supported version. Sometimes it's just a configuration tweak, Jackson 1, Jackson 2 support, depending on the customizations you have done for Jackson, for instance. Moving those to Jackson 2 can be hard or can be easy. What I said, I once did a migration of a new version of Spring to an application that still used struts1, which is basically deprecated. But we couldn't update a struts version or rewrite the whole front end. So what we actually did, we copied the sources from the Spring framework, from the older versions, put them in our own project, in a Spring legacy project, and compiled it with our sources and make sure it worked with, including all the test cases they had for the Spring framework. So it's a migration strategy. I won't recommend it to do this very long in production, but it gives you time to refactor your code base for the front end to a newer technology, or rip it apart if you want to go to a microservices architecture. Well, I already mentioned auto-configuration. It's just configuration. You can basically manually configure everything that's also auto-configured. And it might require some workarounds. I updated the demo. I updated the Spring Boot version I used for the demo. And there were some things that caught me by surprise. It didn't work initially because there were some nice auto-configuration features which interfered with my legacy application. So I'm going to show you that later on. The general advice when you're migrating an application is take small steps. Don't try to do Spring Boot, Spring upgrade, Spring integration upgrade, Spring data in there. Just take small steps. Do one thing at a time, and take your time doing those things. I think I'm going to make Sam Brennan happy. I'm going to say write tests, especially if you do library upgrades and you have a part of the application that uses that library. Write a test for it. So I think Sam is happy with that, especially using JUnit 5 if you can. So I didn't talk that much, so let's go to the demo. I hope it's... Is it readable in the back? And the guys on top there? OK. Do I hear a no? OK. This is our great application. You can already see that's going to be the next big competitor to Amazon.com. It's in Dutch. I'm actually from the Netherlands, so let's put it in English. We already can sell 7 books, so there are a couple missing, but we're getting there. I have some demo accounts. So we have our big friend, John Doe, which apparently ordered some of our books. So he lives in Brussels. Actually, I did the book with a guy from Belgium, so his name wasn't John Doe, but he did live in Brussels, I think. Yeah. So he placed some orders. So that's basically the application. You can add things to the cart, and you do a checkout. It's a basic shopping application. It's your basic order application, which you've probably all written for a pet project or to learn something. So, Oop. Someone used imports. Yeah, it's probably not that readable. So it's a basic Spring MVC application. It's already on Servlet 3.0, so we are a bit lucky. We have a web application initializer, which bootstraps everything. This application predates our nice class hierarchy we have in the newer Spring versions, like the abstract, dispatcher, servlet, web. The abstract annotation dispatcher servlet initializer, or what the thing is called. So we do everything manually. So, and I actually run it on a embedded Tomcat through Maven. So I'm actually using an embedded Tomcat, or at least I'm starting a Tomcat and it's getting deployed. So let's see what happens if, let me close everything else, close others. So I also have a configuration server. which is a basic Spring Boot and Spring Cloud configuration server. You've probably seen one created one or more times this conference, so I'm not going to recreate one. So it's a Spring Boot application with a config server. It runs on the default port, and I didn't trust the Wi-Fi, so I'm using a local Git repository. So let's start the configuration server. So it started. So now I have a legacy application, and I have a configuration server. And I want my legacy application to use the configuration from the config server. So, and I don't have Spring Boot, so how can I do that? Well, first we need the Spring configuration client, because, well, we need the classes for that client. So I thought I commented it out. So let's start with adding that dependency. Let's use the release version. It has been released. So now I have the jar file, but still, we don't use Spring Boot, so it doesn't do anything. So I'm going to cheat a little. Bookstore. So here's our web application initializer. So in Spring, there's the notion of an application context initializer, which you can use to prepare your application context before it actually starts, so you can add stuff to your application context. So I'm going to create one which basically mimics what the Spring config client auto configuration does. And these two classes, the config client properties and the config server property source locator, are classes from the Spring config client project. And I'm going to use this initializer. Now I need to tell the starter or the startup that it needs to use that initializer class. So I'm going to add a couple of init params. I think in the on startup. So I'm setting a well-known property, initializer property, for the global initializer classes, and I'm going to give it my application context initializer. I'm also going to set the config location param and the config location. I'm going to do that later on. Let's comment this out, and let's see what happens. The Spring config client looks for a property named Spring application.name, and I want it to be bookstore. So it's going to look for the configuration of the bookstore application on the config server. So we can, and I would expect that if I do something like this, no. So these are basically the properties that are in the configuration server. So there's some Hibernate configuration in there, which is going to be used. So I added an application context initializer to basically mimic what the Spring Boot configuration client does. And I learned that from one of the auto configuration classes. There is the config client auto configuration, which you can, I thought I had the sources. Okay. Never update your dependency versions before the demo. So there's some other stuff in here, some health servers, and so here we create here's the config client properties created, something I do also. And there's another class. So this is the configuration client, and there is a bootstrap configuration which creates the config service property source locator. So I'm basically mimicking what the Spring config client does. You might wonder why I don't use the configuration classes for directly. I tried that, but because I'm on Spring 3.2, it won't work because there are some annotations and things in there that only work on newer Spring versions. So that's why I'm doing the manual configuration instead of reusing the auto configuration classes. So now I have this, and so it should work. You expect. So let's restart my bookstore application. Let's see what happens. I think it crashes. Ooh. What did I import? Not sure which before that was. Okay. Slip of the finger. So, and a stack trace. Oh boy. Well, actually, that's something I expected. There's this nice message. Could not open servlet context resource none. This is one of the things that caught me by surprise when I upgraded the Spring version, or the Spring Boot version, actually. Newer Spring Boot versions have auto configuration for Jersey, and that has also a web application initializer, which sets the config location initializer parameter. And when you set an init param, you cannot reset it. Great. So we need some trickery for that, or trickery. So this is the actually culprit. This is the actual culprit doing that. And it's part of the Spring jars, or the Spring Boot jars. And because these things are automatically picked up, it will be in there. So, and because there's an add order, it's always taking precedence over our class. I've initially tried with also an add order annotation with the same ordering. That works sometimes. So it might require you to restart, and then it works, and the next time it doesn't work because, well, the ordering sometimes is switched. So, but there's also an interface, priority ordered, which you can implement, which actually takes precedence over ordered, but it's an interface. So it has it's basically like the ordered interface, but it's a special one. Priority ordered, highest precedence. So that was one of the things that caught me by surprise when I updated the Spring Boot version, or the Spring Cloud version actually, which came in with a new Spring Boot version. So let's try again. Oh, I forgot to set something. I should uncomment. I should uncomment this, else it won't work, and I can remove this one because it will be. I now set the init parameter, so the context loader will automatically detect the value of the parameter, which already took precedence over my manual configuration. So it worked this morning, so please let it work. Yeah, it starts. And there you can see that it's fetching the configuration from my server. So I'm now using parts of Spring Cloud without actually using Spring Boot. It's only fetching the configuration, so there's no support for refreshing, and there's no refresh scope. We can try to register that and see what happens, because the scope is just a bean, and it will be automatically registered for you. So let's add it to one of our configuration classes and see what happens. So I think it's a good fit for this one. So just add a bean, public, So refresh scope. Oops. I think it's a bean, yeah, so it needs to be static. So let's see if it works. I think it breaks. Something that caught me by surprise. It actually worked. But there are some, well, it starts, but it doesn't actually work because there's some Spring 4 constructs in there, like add event listener, which doesn't work in Spring 3. So we might need to upgrade Spring as a next step if we want to have to use this. So let's remove this. We'll get there when we have auto configuration. How many time I have left? Ooh, 20 minutes. So the trick I did with the Spring configuration client, you can actually use for other parts of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud also. So just take a look at the configuration class, and you might be able to use that just by importing it with add import in your configuration, or you have to do some manual configuration. So I hope I'm taking away some of the magic of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud also. Still great frameworks. So now that we use the configuration client, let's move a step further. Let's start using Spring Boot. Just let's introduce it as a parent, as you do when if you go to start.spring.io and you create a new project. You will also have this as a parent. So let's add it as a parent to our application, or at least our Maven build file. And let's see what happens. I was mentioning take small steps. These are small steps. So it starts. Hopefully it still works. Let's take a look. And we're still up and running. Also we have some Spring Boot dependencies. They don't do anything yet, but it doesn't interfere with my application. So let's start cleaning up our dependencies. Spring Boot has some pretty nifty dependency management, and you get versions of libraries that actually work together. So let's remove the specific aspect-j version, and we like Hibernate. Remove this one. Tomcat, I want to be specific. I'm not going to upgrade Spring right yet. Let's start with this, and just let's restart the application. I actually created a run task for the Maven build, so it's going to rerun Maven every time. So Spring Boot is now managing part of my dependencies, at least dependency versions, not dependencies yet. So let's use some of the starters that come with Spring Boot to clean up our dependencies. So we have a web application. I'm not using the nifty features of IntelliJ yet, so I'm just going to do it by hand. So it's a web application. We use also validation. There's also a nice starter for that. We use Hibernate with GPA. Spring Boot starter. So let's add that one. So now we can remove a whole bunch of dependencies which are now managed for us. So we don't need this one. We still need Oxum. We don't need WebMVC anymore. We're going to change this to Javax. Servlet Gistel. We still need tiles. Hibernate Entity Manager is managed. The validator is managed. So let's see. We still need the cloud configuration. We have some testing stuff here. There's also a nice starter for that in Spring Boot. So starter test, which should have the scope test. So I can remove this. Well, these are already managed by the parent, so we can also remove a lot of this stuff. I like removing things. I like commits when I remove more lines of code than I'm adding. So I think that's it. This one I don't need anymore. Hibernate is managed for me. Validator, I still need Extreme. This one I don't need. I'm still on Jackson 1, so I'm going to leave that. The logging stuff can also go. Provided stuff, testing stuff. I'm just removing things. So I reduced it in half, something like that. So, and hopefully it still works. I have a skip test, so it doesn't work. Okay. Why doesn't it work? I'm actually deploying a WAR file to Tomcat. And to have a WAR file and JSPs work with Spring Boot, you have to provide some dependencies instead of packaging them in the application. It's actually well documented in the Spring Boot reference guide. So Spring Boot starter Tomcat, because I'm using, and we need to have that on provided. Oh, scope provided. And there's also this one that needs to be scope provided. And there was the Tomcat embedded. I had an issue with the Tomcat Maven plugin with the embedded EL. So I needed to put that on provided as well. Else it wouldn't deploy, or it deployed, and as soon as you started using the application, it would break. So how much of you are using IntelliJ? Okay, yeah. Sometimes people ask why you don't use save. I love the autosave feature in IntelliJ. So. Okay, it deploys. So let's see if it still works. Ooh. Yes, it does. I now have Spring Boot managing my dependencies. I don't have any auto configuration yet, but we're getting there. I still have 5 minutes. So I now have Spring Boot managing my dependencies. So let's see what happens if I remove that last managed version of Spring. So now all of a sudden I go from Spring 3.2 to Spring 4.6. So that's 3 version upgrades. So if we're lucky, it runs, but it breaks. Actually, in Spring 4.1, they removed Jackson 1 support. And I'm still using Jackson 1, so it can't find any of those classes. So let's revert the change and go back to 3.2. And let's write a test for my controller, which retrieves JSON. Actually, I already have the test. It's a basic Spring test using mock MVC. It retrieves an order from the database, passes in some arguments, retrieves an order, puts that in JSON, and it's checking the result. So I put @ignore on it. So let's remove that. I'll run the test case and see if it's green. So it expects a certain order to be in JSON. Of course, in the real life, you would probably write more tests than a single one. So it's green. So for Jackson 1, we're OK. So I have a configuration file for my view resolvers. And I'm actually using the mapping Jackson JSON view for marshalling to JSON. I don't have any customizations for Jackson 1 or how to marshal to JSON or marshal. So I can just switch to Jackson 2. That's basically the change I need to do. I can remove a dependency here. So this is still Jackson 1, so we can remove it. Spring Boot is already managing Jackson 2 for us, so we already have that added. So let's rerun our test. And it still should be green. Sam would be proud of me. Ooh, it's still green. So it bootstraps my configuration, and now I'm using Jackson 2 instead of Jackson 1. I have a test asserting me that it still works and my application should work. So now I can refer to change for this one again. And let's restart. Ooh, Maven also thinks it works. So running a war. We're still fetching the configuration, so that still works. Application boots, and we still have a working application. Still have books, I have checkout, but still no auto configuration. I still use some parts of Spring Boot, but not the full magic of Spring Boot. So we've did all this. So let's make this a Spring Boot application instead of a legacy application for which I build a WAR file and deploy it to an application server. I'm still going to use it as a WAR file, so I'm still going to deploy it, but I'm going to use Spring Boot to our advantage. So let's create an application class. So let's bookstore application. And so it's a Spring Boot application. As we heard, we love annotations, or at least Spring loves annotations. So it's a Spring application, and we want to run it. And we're going to give it the bookstore application. And pass in the arguments. So it does component scanning, but I still have those pesky XML configuration files. So we're going to import those. So they're on the class path in meta-inf Spring application context. So what's in there actually? So there's a property placeholder, there's a component scan in there, and there's a data access context which starts an embedded database, configures an entity manager, and everything. Here are the properties that transaction manager, so it does a lot of configuration in XML. When you want to deploy a Spring Boot application to an application server, you need to extend Spring Boot Servlet Initializer and override or implement the configure class, and you have to give it sources, and that's actually our bookstore application.class again. So now I can run my application as a standalone WAR file for development, and I could also deploy it to Tomcat, and they would both work. So let's remove our old class. So I basically can now remove my web application initializer because, well, I don't really need it anymore. Well, there's one thing we still need to do. We have the open entity manager in view filter. So we need to configure that. So, which with Spring Boot is pretty easy. You just add a bean. You do public open entity manager in view filter. And Spring Boot detects it and registers it as a filter, both in the embedded container as well as when you're deploying it as a WAR file. So this is pretty neat stuff. It's pretty powerful. So now we can just say, well, just remove it. And if I have done everything correctly, at least the test still works. So it's going to do some processing. It uses Spring Boot. We can see the nice banner art. So it's going to add some filters. Ooh. Error page filter. So let's see if it still works. It still works. I'm using JSPs in a WAR file on a deployed application, which is now managed by Spring Boot. So I should also be able to stop it and say, run it. If everything is correct in the Spring Boot reference guide, it should work, which doesn't. That's too bad. I think I have something unprovided that shouldn't be. I had an issue with that. So. There's still some things missing. I'm making the same mistake twice. It's missing some classes, and I missed one vital thing. And to make this work, you really need the Spring Boot Maven plugin, because it repackages our WAR file and adds some additional libraries to the file. Spring Boot Maven plugin. And I can also remove these. So I already had a Maven run task to do that. So let's run it. So I'm now using Maven to run the task because IntelliJ doesn't understand, at least it doesn't run the Maven plugin. So you can see it's running. Now it bootstraps the application. And it started. I'm now running a basic Spring Boot application. And it works. With old-style JSPs, we use tiles. So we have a legacy application, and we slowly integrated Spring Boot in there. I can do a whole workshop about this, but I don't have time in 50 minutes to do a whole workshop. That's basically the demo. Of course, this is a very simplistic demo. It shows you some features, and I hope it shows you something on how you could integrate Spring Boot or some of the technologies of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud into your legacy application without or with going full or not full Spring Boot. I have 2 minutes left, something like that, 1, 2 minutes. So, just 1 minute. So I still have a minute for questions. So if there's someone, that's a question. Yeah, if you know, it's now because it's now a Spring Boot application. If you add the Spring Boot starter actuator, you have metrics. So those will be detected because there's a data source. What we can also do now, because we have Spring Boot, we can basically remove a lot of configuration we have now in our XML files because the data source is auto-configured by Spring Boot. We can also use the automatically configured entity manager. So we can now gradually reduce our XML configuration and hand it over to Spring Boot. And because it's now a Spring Boot application, you can use all the magic. So we could also remove our own Bootstrap class for the configuration client and use the full potential of the configuration client, for instance, or the Eureka service discovery. Any more questions? OK, then I thank you. And if you have questions, then you feel free to come over here or find me on the conference. Enjoy your last hours on the conference. Thank you.